Over the years, whenever this gospel reading has come up, I have had at least one person who is divorced or remarried ask me, are they committing adultery in their new relationship? Is their new relationship sinful? And my answer has always been, it depends. And then I get the same look I think Jesus got when he first affirmed the sanctity of the marriage relationship. Today's gospel is one of those really difficult readings that we hear, because the lens we use to unpack what it says is different than the one that was in use when Jesus said it. Today we marry presumably because there is a degree of love and affection between two people. This was not the norm in first century Israel. Marriage was more of a contract than a covenantal relationship. Remember, in those days, Israel was primarily an agrarian culture. Some exceptions we know of are those who lived by the water were fishermen, and those who lived in the city were largely craftsmen. And together, these three aspects of the community provided for the needs of the people, much as they do today. Very few lived a life we would describe as a life of luxury. Most worked hard from dawn to dusk, and the Sabbath was their only day of rest. They worked hard because if they didn't eat. There were no real safety nets to care for people as we have today, especially for those who grew too old or feeble to work. Therefore, men married to have children, who would then grow up and participate in the family business and then take care of him in his old age. Just as today, there were some things back then men could not do on their own. I couldn't imagine what it would be. One is, they could not have their own children. So, they married so that they would have a wife who would bear children and who would then manage the house while they worked in the fields or went fishing or whatever it was they did. The more children, the more their family business could do, and in theory, the greater the abundance they would enjoy. It was not uncommon for multiple generations to live, if not together, in very close proximity to one another. And this was true whether they lived in the rural or city life. Archaeological studies have found dwellings with room after room being added onto it around this central dwelling place, presumably to accommodate the growing family. And many scholars believe that this is the image Jesus had when he offered us that metaphor, as I go to my Father's house has many rooms, and I go to prepare a place for you. If it was found the wife could not, or could no longer bear children, or if she was not able to manage the household, they were seen as of little use. And husbands sought to replace them. Now this sounds cold and heartless in our world today. But in a time when no children, meant no security in their old age, it meant one of two things. Either the man divorced the woman to find another who could provide what he needed, or if he was wealthy enough, he could take on a second wife or a concubine to provide what she could not. Here's the problem women face then. If they were divorced, this meant they were of no use. They had no value, no worth. So they were forced then to live on the charity of their children, if they had it, or the community. And in a culture where if you could not contribute, you were seen as a drain on the available and sometimes often limited resources, life for a woman after divorce in first century Israel was anything but prosperous. Unlike today, there was no alimony to help support her. And she had no possessions because everything belonged to the husband. It is in this context we find Jesus confronted by some Pharisees asking what they believe is an ethical question. Can a man divorce his wife? To which Jesus provides a moral response, reminding them Scripture describes marriage not as a contract as it had become, but as a covenantal relationship. In doing so, he re-images this view of a wife as property to one of being equal in status to her husband. Note that in the reading today, Jesus says even a woman can divorce her husband. Something that would have been totally against the culture of that day. But divorce is not the real issue, nor do I believe remarriage is either. The issue I believe Jesus is addressing is their failure to see one another as equally created in the image of God. The hardness of heart Jesus describes in the beginning of our reading is what keeps them, and us frankly, from seeing this in one another. And as a result, instead of seeking relationship with, we seek power over the other. And this power we seek is what creates an unfaithfulness, an imbalance in our relationships. Instead of being true to one another, one seeks control over the other so that they can put their own wants and desires ahead of the needs of those they are supposed to be in relationship with. And when this happens, there's no longer a relationship because we no longer see one another as having worth. Another point I think Jesus is making here, and elsewhere in Scripture, is that everyone has worth. Even the children. Notice over the last 3 weeks, he's kept going back to children and holding them up, raising them up as somebody to be seen as of value. Because we are all created in the image of God. And when we treat one another otherwise, when we only seek to satisfy our own passions and desires, the result is relationships fall apart. And in the process, someone gets hurt. And the one who causes the hurt, Jesus describes, bears a responsibility that never goes away. But that was then. Today, there's a difference. Today, we can seek forgiveness for whatever part we played in the breakdown of our relationships. Because through the cross, Jesus opened the way for each of us to know God's grace. All we need to do is ask, and we're told we will receive. So the follow-up comment I offer following the "it depends" is, have we sought forgiveness? If we have, we no longer live a life of sin that Jesus describes. We live a life of grace. Being given a second chance to be in a relationship that reminds and affirms to us exactly who we are. One of God's own. Being created in the image of God is not something we go around bragging about, but a responsibility that challenges us to see this in others. When we're able to see this, our tendencies to think only of ourselves, to judge others as unworthy of our respect, or to discard people as if they have no worth, is replaced with the desire to be in relationship with one another. And being in relationship, seek to serve one another instead of demanding to be served. This is true of our individual relationships, as well as in the relationships we enjoy here as part of a community. You see, it's in community that our relationships get strengthened. through our service to one another. Everything we do, everything we give, big or small, is of worth because it's not about what one gets or gives. It is about what we receive. And what is it we receive? Grace. Unending grace. Grace that nourishes our relationships with God and one another. Grace that enables us to look at one another and see each other as having worth. Grace that reminds us we are able to see worth in others because God first saw worth in us. Amen.